Hi, everybody. Welcome to this latest episode of Real Talk with Rick. So I am excited to introduce our own Congress representative, our 3rd Congressional District Representative, Dean Phillips. Dean is one of the representatives representing the state of Minnesota in Washington. He came on the Real Talk with Rick podcast and talked about his background growing up in St. Paul, his involvement in several different businesses, which led to an eventual inspiration to run for Congress back in 2015 for the 2018 election cycle. So you get to hear about Dean's life leading up to his time in Congress and what have been some of the highlights of his first session, his first 2 years in Congress. So here is my conversation with Representative Dean Phillips. Representative Dean Phillips, thank you for coming in today. It's great to have you.
Good to be here, Rick.
Appreciate it. How'd you hear about this?
Well, believe it or not, Twitter is good for some things, not so good for other things, but it's really good to listen and observe what people are talking about and what's important, and we discovered you on Twitter. So congratulations.
Wow. Thank you. Someone's listening, Johnny. Someone's listening to us. That's awesome.
Yes, we are.
Do you listen to any other podcasts you listen to?
You know, in fact, let me just pop open my podcast list. I'll give you the last handful that I've listened to. This was a good one. Issue 1 has one called Swamp Stories, which is about money and politics that I encourage everybody to listen to. Dolly Parton's America. You haven't heard that one?
Yeah, I have heard of that. Yeah. I have heard of
that. HBR had a good one on Homo sapiens.
Okay.
Just that one. And then Radiolab has some
good ones
too, yeah. So those, I'll tell you, one challenge, though, in this new job of mine is it's hard to find time to listen to podcasts. I find a lot of time to listen to constituents and be in the community, but having blocks of time to listen to podcasts has been tough, which is actually why I like flying. The only reason I like flying back and forth from Washington to Minnesota is it gives me that hour and 45 minutes to do some reading and a little bit of listening.
That's good. Well, you would think the car, but maybe, a lot of calls that you're making in the car. But the car, walking the dog, jogging, that type of thing. I think that's why the podcast thing has been such a hit.
And I'm not yet one of those guys. I walk to work in Washington. I got a 15-minute walk. It's really a highlight of my day. But I'm not yet one of those guys that has the earbuds sticking out of my ears. I want to be a man of the people, accessible.
I think you can be a man of the people with some AirPods in on the way to work.
Ricky just liberated me in ways I can't even describe.
I just gave you 15 more minutes to learn.
Thank you.
So you personally, what social media platform do you use most? What works for you?
So we have an official presence on just about every platform. I spend a lot of time on Twitter. Not necessarily. I'm not a big poster, but I do a lot of listening and a lot of discovery and a lot of my news. I have found that when news breaks, it's often first breaking on Twitter before even the networks pick it up. So a lot on Twitter. I think we reach more people on Facebook. But we in this day and age, you can't be on just one platform. You have to be. We're on Facebook, Instagram.
Sure.
Different demographics are tuning into different channels. But I got to tell you, at the end of the day, we all have to spend a little bit more time in face to face and in front of one another, and not as much time on social media.
No, understood. So the debate last night. Did you watch the debate?
I'm afraid to say yes.
Okay, and I don't want to see it. It's more about you, but just really quickly, were you looking at Twitter while you were watching the debate?
I was.
Okay, because that's something people might
do. It's interesting. I'm glad you asked that question because I found myself looking at Twitter to see if people were responding the same way I was.
Sure.
Which you can imagine. I thought last night was really horrifying and embarrassing, and I'm saddened by the erosion of decency and respect when it comes to presidential politics. It's actually one reason I ran for Congress, and to see it playing out now on both sides of the aisle to some degree is really disheartening, but that's why I ran, and that's why I'm actually hopeful, because there are a lot more good people in government, the present company included, than I think a lot of people recognize, and it's not all that bad. I just don't like the fact that what's portrayed on TV all the time are these brawls and disrespect and mean-spiritedness.
But as you said, if you're talking to people directly in our community, your district, Washington, one-on-one, you're going to get a lot of good information.
No question. In fact, that's the lesson I try to share every single day wherever I am, is that these are kindergarten lessons. Respect, decency, don't judge a book by its cover, and we shouldn't judge people until we actually get to know them. And that is true from the president all the way down into our neighborhoods and communities. We have to spend more time understanding each other and being intentional about it, because there are a lot of forces working against that right now, and we have to overcome them.
Sure. My Twitter experience is being from Wisconsin, being a Packer fan. I'm on Twitter during the Packer game to see how everyone feels like I do.
If I had known that, I would never have consented to this podcast.
You would have. You would have. You're good. So let's go back. I want to kind of trace your point leading up to where you are right now, if you don't mind. You were born in St. Paul, right? So how do you get from St. Paul to here? How does that happen? You don't have to give me your whole life story, but just in terms of where you grew up.
So I was born in Miller Hospital in downtown St. Paul on January 20th, 1969. Happens to be the date that Richard Nixon was inaugurated into office and Lyndon Johnson left, which is kind of an interesting bookend. And I lost my father in the Vietnam War when I was just 6 months old. And my mother was 24 and widowed, and we lived with my great-grandparents in St. Paul for the first 2.5 years of my life. And when I was about 3, my mom met a remarkable man and remarried, Eddie Phillips, who adopted me and into a remarkable family. And I've lived on both sides of advantage, which really illuminates a lot of my intention and mission in this job and in our community. And I think about that every day, and I reflect back on the day that I remember being the same age that my birth father was on the day that he was killed in Vietnam, and recognizing every day since then is a blessing, not to be wasted, and to do my best to share opportunity with others.
Absolutely. And you then, through that, came upon some interesting, would be grandparents, right?
Are you talking about the advice business?
I am.
Yeah.
I am.
Dear Abby and Ann Landers are my grandmother and my aunt.
Yeah, I read a little bit about that. I didn't know until I was kind of prepping for this. But you actually, they'd send you some of the letters that teenagers would get when you were younger, and they want you to weigh in?
Batches of letters.
Like what? Like what would you weigh in on?
So this is in the analog era, of course, and my grandmother in this case, Dear Abby. So, by the way, Dear Abby and Ann Landers, of course, twin sisters, raised in Sioux City, Iowa, became popular in the 1950s. My grandmother's maiden name was Pauline Friedman, and her sister was Esther Friedman. But their middle names were the reverse, so Polly Esther and Esther Pauline. So we called my grandmother Polly Esther.
Okay.
Just as a little tidbit.
Yeah. Yep.
And she would send my brother Tyler and me letters from teenagers when we were in high school. And to her credit, she had a Rolodex as big as any I've ever seen in my life. In fact, we still have it. And she would receive 10,000 letters a week often, and every letter got a response. Some from her directly, more from her staff. But she would send letters from teenagers to ask us for perspective. What was the dating life like in high school, and emotional issues and relationship issues, and how world issues were impacting young people. And it was cool to share a little perspective with our grandmother.
Yeah, and what's interesting, so I was born the same year you were. So I remember a time when we had 4 channels on TV, mm-hmm. and we had a newspaper, actually a newspaper in the afternoon, right?
Sure.
And that was syndicated everywhere throughout the country. So I'm sure there's some people listening going, absolutely, I know what that's all about, and probably some younger people that are thinking, I don't even know what he's talking about.
It's amazing. There's a fine demographically you can tell right away. But I hear to this day, as I represent our community, I hear from people all the time who share stories about growing up, often in rural areas, at a time where there weren't many people to turn to, when they faced issues that at that time were hard to talk about, and how my grandmother and her sister were really sources of help, mm-hmm. And it meant a lot to a lot of people's lives. So very
Absolutely.
much inspires me to this day.
I think it's pretty neat, too, that you said they responded to every letter.
They did.
It's only, 2 or 3 that would appear in the paper, but they probably got thousands.
And interestingly enough, now I'm in the business where we're getting thousands of letters a week, and it's the same mission to respond to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about liquor. Let's talk about liquor. So that you mentioned that, Phillips. So that you spent quite a bit of time there, right? That was you went to Brown, then your MBA at the U, right? And then into the family business?
Yeah, so born in St. Paul, ended up growing up in Edina. In my early years, went to Edina Highlands. Forgive me,
I won't hold that against you, yeah.
I love Eden Prairie. And
more so.
Lived part of my life in the city, now live in Deep Haven. And when I was a young guy, graduated college, I wanted to work in our family business, which was the Phillips distilling business. And my dad terribly disappointed me by saying, no, you got to go work elsewhere. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I worked for a little startup company called In Motion, local company. We made bicycle apparel and equipment. And I made lots of mistakes, learned a lot of lessons, eventually asked to join the family business. My dad said, under a couple conditions, you work twice as hard, you're going to be paid half as much, and you're going to be held to a higher standard. And again, I'm glad he did. It didn't feel good at the time, but I went to work in our production department. I was a sales rep calling on small-town taverns all throughout Minnesota and the upper Midwest. Worked in our warehouse and learned some of the most important lessons I've learned in my life from extraordinary people with whom I worked, and very much illuminates my work to this day.
And it was a distribution. So you were like you were making calls like we have, our liquor stores here in town. So obviously
I called on Eden Prairie.
You'd come here, and you would
talk I remember being a junior rep in the early days and calling on the municipal stores, including Eden Prairie, and all around the state. And we both distributed products. We also distilled and bottled our own. So I worked. Remember Laverne and Shirley?
Yeah,
our
Milwaukee,
production,
Wisconsin.
Bingo. Our production facility, which was at that time in northeast Minneapolis, was right out of Laverne and Shirley.
Okay.
Great experience.
Well, the business started before Prohibition, wasn't it? Candy and magazines and provisions or whatnot? Yeah,
my family, immigrant family from Eastern Europe, fleeing persecution as a Jewish family. Settled, parts of my family settled in Wisconsin, eventually made their way to Eau Claire, and then I do have Wisconsin roots, I must say, Rick.
Good.
Ended up in Minnesota, but started as a candy and newspaper distributor. And then after Prohibition ended in 1933, the Canadian distillers, which were ready to get back into the market here in America, were looking for small regional distributors like my great-grandfather had set up, and they entered that business.
Well, I think the first taste of alcohol I had, I won't say what age, I think was a Phillips schnapps, peppermint schnapps of some sort. That was a pretty big product.
It's either lime vodka or peppermint schnapps.
Ugh.
It's part of our culture, which is what I love. And by the way, nothing more Minnesota than what we made. A great local brand made by local people. Very few know that Phillips invented schnapps. We had a sales rep named Al Dorsch, who was calling on saloons on Washington Avenue in downtown Minneapolis right after Prohibition, 1934 or so. And he saw that men in the saloons were putting peppermint candy into their poorly aged bourbon that was coming back onto the market to make it a little more palatable. And he went to my grandfather, Al Dorsch did, to my grandfather, J. Phillips, great-grandfather, and he said, hey, in the old country, we made something called peppermint schnapps. These guys are putting peppermint into their bad whiskey. Why don't we make one? And they did, and became America's first schnapps brand. But what's most important and little known is that in the 1940s, he set up one of the very first profit-sharing programs in the entire country, documented, which I keep on my desk, the original articles of kind of incorporation of this profit-sharing program. So taking care of people and community is really a big part of our family ethos. And I'm one who always says you can be pro-business and pro-labor. They're not mutually exclusive. And I'm trying to build those bridges because that's how we all do better.
And you then, and when you were actively involved, named a vodka after our city.
Yes, Prairie. It was all because of you.
Absolutely, or our city.
Yeah. Eden didn't make the cut, but Prairie I kept in there.
I understood.
It was a big battle.
Didn't get through marketing, but the Prairie part got through marketing.
Sure did. In fact, another good story. I was in Santiago, Chile, about 20 years ago, and went to a grocery store and saw a display of corn. But it didn't just say corn; it said Minnesota corn in Santiago, Chile. I thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea that Minnesota corn had this kind of brand in other parts of the world. and came home and thought, if Minnesota corn was a brand, why don't we make a Minnesota corn vodka? Most vodkas in America are made from corn. So we partnered with 3 family farmers here in Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, and created the first spirit that we know in the entire world that you can trace back to the very ground from which it came. And I'm proud of that.
That's neat. A couple of your other businesses that my kids are enjoy. The gelato, they like that. I mean, and there was a time, when the gelato was not a big product in this country at all. I mean, you could maybe find it in a restaurant or a location, but Talenti, right?
Talenti.
You got Talenti, and that's everywhere now.
It is, and before Talenti, my father pioneered the luxury vodka category with Belvedere vodka, and the idea was to kind of raise the category. At that time, most of the products were priced about half as much. All the brands competed against each other. The idea was to create something a little more elegant, a little more expensive, a little more exclusive. And then the Talenti project was actually the same template, which was you have ice cream brands, Haagen-Dazs, Ben & Jerry's, very popular, competing against each other. How do you create a new category? And Talenti was established by Josh Hochschuler, who became our partner down in Dallas, Texas. And it was a wonderful partnership. We built it from nothing into a wonderful brand and sold it to Unilever.
Well, so Unilever owns that now?
Unilever owns it now.
Okay.
Ben & Jerry's people.
Is a concept that it's made from, it's not corn syrup, right? It's made from more pure cane sugar.
So Talenti, so gelato is made, it's actually lighter than ice cream. People don't realize that. Tastes better, much more dense. And Talenti, the beauty of Talenti was that it did use the finest ingredients in the entire world. Josh was a magician with coming up with wonderful creations in his lab, and we used the very best, and we're proud of it.
A lot of flavor. You had a lot of flavors.
So all we asked is that people have 1 pint a night.
That's all.
Just all.
That's
Fair
all.
Enough. 1 pint
Fair
a
enough.
night.
So I did not realize this till the other day, too, that Penny's Coffee. And that's a beautiful location, like Washington and Hennepin. That's a beautiful building. I don't know how many. You have 2 or 3 locations?
So we have 4 total locations: downtown Minneapolis, Linden Hills, Wayzata in the district, and then we just did a partnership with Lululemon at their flagship store at the Mall of America, and we're doing the cafe in their store too.
And so the Talenti thing is more recent past, but Penny's Coffee is something that you're still involved in actively right now.
Penny's is brand new. In fact, after we sold Talenti, the next project was Penny's. I thought I'd be dedicating myself entirely to it. But after that 2016 election, I woke up the next morning. I told my daughters I was going to do something, be a participant, not a complainer. In the meantime, we had just started Penny's, which is now managed so wonderfully by our staff and managers. But I thought I'd be dedicating myself fully to it. And by the way, Penny's is so much more than coffee. It's about a place to gather, which I love. And crepes. Yeah, we do coffee and crepes and all kinds of good stuff. But the real business of Penny's is creating remarkable spaces for people to get together. And nothing makes me happier than when I see 2 empty coffee cups, because that's when I know people had a conversation, and we need more of them.
So then, some of this discussion kind of builds to a run for Congress. I mean, you're obviously in a lot of different areas, and you could keep busy for as long as you want, but obviously there's a decision you made, 2014, 2015, 16, where you said that I want to step up for elected office. So what spurred that? How did that come about?
I'll tell you, Rick, I had always been engaged, but never run for office, and never really worked on a campaign. I'd supported certain campaigns, and I was an intern back in 1989 for Senator Patrick Leahy in Washington. It was one of the most transformative summers of my life because I got to see firsthand how our system of governance works. But I knew at that time I wasn't going to become a politician. But I always thought that if the opportunity arose and the need existed, if that intersection appeared, that I would consider it. And when I watched the 2016 presidential campaign between Clinton and Trump, I was so dismayed about how we had devolved into this lack of discourse, this mean-spiritedness, this lack of respect. And I remember watching the election night with my daughters and my family. And I woke up the next morning and very sincerely, like I just said moments ago, I promised them at the breakfast table that I would do something. And I didn't know at that very moment what it would be. But I'd raised them like probably a lot of people listening to this right now. You raise your children to not just be observers, but to be participants. And if they see injustice, to act on it. And if they see bullying, to stop it and to be courageous. And there's that moment that I think we all, at some point in our respective lives, get to, that moment where you're faced with a challenging decision about what you're going to do. And I thought I didn't want to look back 10, 20, 30 years later, God willing, and say I didn't try. And my foremost mission is to try to generate respect and restore faith and trust in government again, because we need it. And that is the foundational work that I want to inspire more people to do and encourage more people to run for office, recognize that public service is a beautiful commitment. And but for those willing to do so, all would be lost. And I'm working hard to that end, trying to be respectful, decent, inspire great conversations between Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, and get people to rejoice again in differences. And that is, in my estimation, what makes this country wonderful and unique.
So after the time you've now been in office, how's that played out in terms of that initial inspiration and what you're actually seeing?
I'll tell you what, first, I love my job. I never would have imagined that I would be telling you a year into my first year in Congress how much I love it. Helping people is one of the most rewarding pursuits one can ever undertake, and that is really what we do. My wonderful staff, both here in Minnesota and in Washington, help people every day, and with some of the most challenging human issues you could possibly imagine. I love that aspect. I also am pleased to report that one of my biggest surprises so far is how collegial members of Congress are with one another. If you exclusively watch Fox News or MSNBC or spend all your time on Twitter, you would never know that there's a lot of good going on. And there are friendships being built, and there is trust, and there is a nucleus of us there, both Democrats and Republicans, that want to do better. And I joined the Problem Solvers Caucus right after I went to Congress. 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans. We meet once a week at a table. We hear a provocative presentation on an issue area, and we talk. And we are the intentional core of Congress, 50 of us, that are really trying to change the ethos of a place that really needs it, because Congress is terribly designed to accomplish our mission. And in no small part because the currency in Congress is knowledge and relationships. And it serves leadership, both Democratic leadership and Republican leadership, to limit how much new members know and the time that they have to build relationships, because it's probably self-apparent why. So a lot of us are on a mission to decentralize power, to generate more conversation, and most importantly, start telling more of the stories of the good stuff going on in Congress that never will make it to the cable news because it doesn't generate the same interest as fighting.
Sure. So give me some names. Who are some colleagues that you've gotten to know that you are working with both sides of the aisle? Who are some people that you've developed relationships with?
So just on the Problem Solvers Caucus alone, starting with Pete Stauber, fellow congressman, my colleague from northern Minnesota.
Sure.
We both came in as freshmen. We did not know each other before going to Washington. And I respect Pete. We don't see everything the same way. We're not supposed to. We represent different districts. We have different life experiences. But we respect each other. And I think of Anthony Gonzalez, former NFL football player, a new member of Congress from Ohio, a gentleman, brilliant, principled, and one of my best friends in Washington.
Is it the Tony Gonzalez, the tight end for the Kansas City Chiefs?
This is Anthony Gonzalez, played for the Colts.
Oh.
And maybe another team, too.
Good.
I think it was the Colts.
Yeah.
And I think about William Timmons from South Carolina, who serves on the Modernization Committee in Congress and is doing great work to try to help change the process in Washington. And literally the first person I met on day one of our orientation. There are Lloyd Smucker, Republican from from Pennsylvania. I went with Lloyd to McAllen, Texas last year. I went 2 times with the Problem Solvers Caucus, and we saw with our own eyes what was happening at our border. And it was so impactful that a number of us sat down at the hotel that night after seeing some of the most horrific things we've ever seen as both parents and Americans and as humans. And we sat down at a table that night at a hotel, talked about what we had experienced that day, and we shed tears together. And we resolved to do something about it. And Lloyd and I now are co-chairing a task force through the Problem Solvers Caucus to present a immigration reform plan that embodies both some conservative perspectives with some more progressive perspectives and combine border security with humanity. That's an example of good work being done, and that's happening every day. But it's again not part of the kind of the media's interest.
Sure. You have, is it almost 40 cities in your district here? Mm-hmm. And I want to say, I think within your first month of coming into office, you did reach out to myself and the mayor. Let's sit down. Let's talk. I'm your new representative. That was much appreciated. And
thank you.
And thank you for that. And we had a great conversation initially. That's when I met you. But you've had to do that with almost 40 some communities. Yeah. So how do you keep up with that? How do you?
So when I decided to run for Congress, I wanted to do that differently, be invitational, not confrontational, to introduce myself to people in our community who weren't accustomed to perhaps seeing a Democrat show up in their neighborhood, to create a joyful mission. And
a Democrat showing up in the neighborhood. That
Democrat,
sounds like a title of a.
It's going to be your next podcast.
Yeah, it might be the title of this podcast.
There you go.
Yeah.
And one of the first things I did is buy a 1960 International Harvester Metro van, old delivery truck, that's called the Government Repair Truck. I had a service window, so I can serve coffee and lemonade when I drive into neighborhoods. We use it in parades. But it was literally a vehicle to get people to talk again. And it also reminds people of a time where we used to do that in the 1960s. And then when we succeeded in the campaign and I became a member of Congress, I also wanted to change how representation is affected. It starts with listening. So we now have a very simple mechanism. We convene mayors throughout the district, city council members, staff, police chiefs, fire chiefs, school superintendents. And I don't talk, I listen, and my staff listens. And the issues that we hear at those tables, and sometimes it's over pancakes, sometimes it's over coffee, sometimes in the afternoon in various city halls. We listen, we take what we hear, we bring it to Washington, and if there's not existing legislation that will solve the problem that was brought to our attention, we write legislation. And there have been a couple of examples of things that we've heard just by those listening sessions that we've actually gotten passed into law. One of them was WAFTA, the fire training facility here. Exactly.
Right.
That had been for decades, unaddressed. And it's just, it's interesting. There's a simplicity that if more broadly embraced could get a lot more done in Washington. And it starts with listening.
What would be one, and you've given good examples of what you've seen with the Problem Solvers Caucus. What would be what's the most fascinating thing you think you've discovered in your time in Washington?
Let me start by saying probably the most important work that we've done in the Problem Solvers Caucus was actually based on a discovery. This discovery was that the power in Washington is often concentrated in one office. In the case of the Senate, it's Mitch McConnell. He decides on every bill whether it will get a vote on the floor or not, which is why we now have over 275 bipartisan bills that we passed in the House that are now sitting on his desk. And he has the authority to preclude those from even receiving a vote. The same was true in the House, which really bothered me. I don't think it appropriate for one person to decide what's important. The whole point of the People's House is that power be disseminated, that we bring back what our communities want, and we get to it. So we in the Problem Solvers Caucus decided to collectively withhold our support for Speaker Pelosi until she agreed to a very significant rules change, which now requires that any bill that has 290 co-sponsors, which makes it bipartisan by definition, has to receive a vote on the House floor. And it wasn't well reported. It wasn't covered much because it was a little bit wonky. But it's probably one of the most important changes to the House rules in a long, long time. And it goes to show that when you work with like-minded people, you mobilize, you use principle to dictate your mission, we can accomplish things. But what has surprised me, Rick, more than anything else, is how the design of Congress is so woefully broken. The social design, the physical design, and the organizational design. Anybody that comes from any institution, business, organization would get to Congress and feel the same way. I think that one of the problems is Congress is populated by a lot of people that only know legislative backgrounds or legislative experience, not enough people that have more broad organizational experience in which, if they did, Congress would be better designed to collaborate. So that's what I'm really focused on right now, is helping improve the process. I talked about orientation, I think, going into the first day of orientation, going on separate buses to separate events in Washington. Okay. The day we get there, Democrats put on one bus, Republicans put on another bus. Instead of breaking bread, getting to know each other,
sure.
I joke, doing a ropes course or something to build trust. That systematic separation begins on day one. Mm-hmm. We got to change the social design. We should encourage relationship building, not diminish or prevent it. The physical design, we work in lovely early 20th century, late 19th century buildings, but not designed for the work in this day and age. Small offices, compartmentalized, little light, no public spaces. And I believe design can drive outcomes. The organizational design is woefully broken. The committees have unusual jurisdictions and purviews. The way we select committee chairs, I believe, is broken. The way that money plays a role is also horribly corrupting and disenfranchising.
Well, that was a big part of your initial, when you were campaigning, and before you discovered what was there. Campaign finance reform was a big
and it's probably
initiative.
my foremost objective is to at least start a conversation about how we finance campaigns in our country, because it is woefully broken. I'm the only member of Congress that takes no PAC money of any kind, that takes no federal lobbyist money of any kind, but also takes no fellow member money of any kind, because the money game played inside of Congress is just horribly corrupting and has a lot to do with what committee assignments you get. And when you get a certain committee assignment that has access to a lot of PAC money, then your dues to your party go up. And it's a disgusting system. Furthermore, my colleagues are now spending over 10,000 hours per week, 10,000 hours per week raising money. And I don't know many jobs in this country where you could spend 10, 20, 30 hours a week doing something completely outside of the responsibility of your work that you're paid for. And by the way, when I say paid for, everybody listening to this is paying the salaries of members of Congress. And it's got to change.
You're constantly campaigning.
Yeah, in a way, I'll tell you, to me, if you serve your community well and you do your job well, you get reelected. I think we put too much into the fundraising, too much into the campaigning, and less. I'd like to see members of Congress put more into serving. And that means getting out into communities and listening to people. That means going to places where few others have gone. That means listening to people who might disagree with you. That means showing up in public and having town hall meetings and community conversations and taking the heat. Criticism is fine if it's done respectfully. But many hide behind the veil of campaigning and the bigger veil of money. Putting an ad on TV that costs a lot of money is easy. Getting out and talking to people, it's a little harder, and I wish more would do it.
Right. And when I say constantly campaigning, it's just that when you have an election for your office every other year, that feels like constantly campaigning. No, give me some hope.
Oh, there's a
give
lot.
Give me some hope. Give me some, and obviously there's quite a bit that you've been doing. You're talking about across the aisle, some of the stuff you've done, but there's some hope in all this, right?
I am I can share as much hope as you can imagine. I'm overflowing with it. In fact, there's no question that part of this undertaking began with dismay, but that has been converted into optimism. And I see how we can fix things. I see the power of relationships. I see how we can use history and tradition to actually to embellish this rather difficult work with respect for it. I see things happening right now in Congress that are reasons to be hopeful. I see collaboration that has been successful despite the great divisions, including with this president and this Senate and this House. Despite the obvious divisions, we've gotten a lot of things done. Passed a USMCA bill, a trade bill that was terribly important. We repealed a medical device tax, which is really important for Minnesota businesses. We accomplished something that people said would never get done, which is a DED, Deferred Enforced Departure, which is a big issue to many Liberian people who came to America many years ago. Were on a program that was supposed to be temporary and had to wake up every night at the end of one-year extensions wondering if they would be thrown out of our country. The president signed a bill that actually affords a pathway to citizenship for our wonderful Liberian community right here in the 3rd District. Mm-hmm. Things are getting done. What I struggle with, and the reason that so many don't feel the same hope I do, is that delivering that message is difficult. Mm-hmm. I don't have the most Twitter followers in Congress. The people that do tend to be the most divisive people. And that is something I wish more people would take a moment to reflect on. And all it means is that we have to dig a little bit deeper and search a little bit more wide for the good stories. And also, I think we all have a responsibility to break bread with people who see things a little bit differently. Give a high five, a handshake, or a hug to somebody who you may disagree with, but you realize that we're in it together. Well, and that's my mission. And that's why I'm hopeful.
You learn so much from people that disagree with you. You learn so much. So we've got a couple minutes left. Stepping away from Washington, Congress, elected office, what else do you don't have? I mean, you probably don't have any free time, but you've got to carve out some free time. What else?
I'm reading. This job is consuming. I'm not going to kid anybody, but it's a joyful consumption. I knew I was getting into a difficult circumstance. I knew it would leave little free time for me. I knew it would complicate some of the most important relationships in my life. But I also knew that if I didn't do it and didn't try, that I would forever regret it. And, there are two kinds of people in the world, I think. Those who only can find the bad in people and things, and those who always can find the good in people and things. I'd like to think of myself as the latter. And in this job, I have found joys that I never even had contemplated when I first set out to do it. And no, I don't have much free time. But the time I do have, I value. Mm-hmm. And earlier in this conversation, I talked about the moment I realized I was a day older than my dad was when he was killed in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And it's that knowledge and belief and recognition, that every day is really a blessing that makes it joyful. And God willing, I'll have time down the road to do more reading and more relaxing. But in the meantime, this mission is a darn important one, and I love it.
Well, that's great to hear.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you coming on and spending some time with me on this Eden Prairie podcast.
Thanks for the invitation. And this is what I love, conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you.